So I'd now like to introduce our next presenter, Michael Brooks. Michael is a partner at the law firm of Bracewell in Washington, D.C., where he focuses his practice in the areas of energy, commodities, and derivatives law. Michael represents energy and commodity trading companies in a wide variety of commercial, regulatory, compliance, and enforcement matters. He also actively represents clients in investigations and regulatory matters involving FERC, the CFTC, and designated contract markets like ICE. Today, Michael will provide a FERC update and discuss the impacts of regulatory changes in our industry. Please join me in welcoming Michael Brooks.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'll tell you, as a speaker, you watch all the other speakers, and you get nervous the better they are. And I got really nervous after the first panel, and I got more nervous after the next panel. And the last speaker was the worst because you can follow a great speaker, but then follow a great speaker who teaches everybody how to critique you. So I'm going to show you my hands. We're safe. This is a safe place. It really is a pleasure to be here. I want to share with you, I'll start by actually taking from Lisa's guidelines. I'll start with sharing with you my goal. My primary objective is to add some kind of value. So I've got a little bit of your time today. I'm going to try and share something with you that's useful to you. And I think there are three things I could do. I could share you one. I'd like to share at least one thing with you that you didn't already know. So hopefully you'll learn at least one thing today. And I have 6 slides, I think, substantively. So hopefully 6, but I'd like to set the standards low so I can make sure I meet them. So at least one good takeaway. Second, I'd like to say something. I hope I say at least one thing that you agree with. But then the third, actually, I really would like to say something you disagree with. I'd like to challenge you to think about something a different way, and then you hopefully challenge me to think about it your way. And maybe when we compare notes, we come up with the right answer. Because I'll start with, I'm going to talk with you about what's going on at FERC, things that I find of interest that I think will be of interest to you. I don't know a lot. And anybody who tells you they know a lot about what's going on at FERC right now, they're wrong. There's no use in predicting with any certainty what will happen next at FERC. But I'm going to try and shed some light on that situation, how we got there, where that may lead us. So to start, make sure these are working. Yes. Let me start just by sharing a few thoughts on the commission itself. So I went to law school at a school that was primarily libertarians. Almost everybody there was a libertarian. And I left law school and went and worked before FERC. And so I sat across the table from FERC staffers. And I would go back to my alumni events and I would say, guys, I found an agency that works. Like, it really works well. They don't get it right all the time. I disagree with them a lot, but they're hardworking. They're doing things. You got Democrats and Republicans on a commission together who vote things out. And one side wins sometimes, but they vote them out unanimously usually. And in the last couple of years, I don't think I could say that as well. And it's not because any individuals at FERC are doing something wrong. I think it's what we've done to FERC in the last couple of years. And it really is just representative of what is going on in our society. And that is a pretty strong divide on some pretty core issues. But normally that doesn't have a major impact at FERC because we have a majority running the commission and the minority gets drug along if that's what it takes. But for this commission, I have to put quotes up for this commission because it's been actually a couple commissions in the last couple of years, really. We've had, at first, a commission that had no quorum, so they could not act. No matter how much agreement they could reach across the party lines, no matter what the issue, they had no authority to act. Then we got a quorum, and we pretty quickly went to a 2-2 split. And historically, 2-2 splits have not been a problem at FERC. But we haven't had the kind of historic issues that we're facing today. The divide between, does FERC consider the environment and way downstream impacts, or is FERC a rate-making agency only, and that's its role, and it needs to stick to that role? And that divide really created a gridlock and a 2-2 tie that normally doesn't happen, I think, at FERC, in my experience. So once we get past a temporary 2-2 tie, we end up with a change in chairman. And so the few times where we've had some ability to do things, we've been transitioning where we've been replacing staff's been retiring, and we've been trying to put in new staffers. or we've been trying to set up an agenda or struggling with that transition. So I think when I think of this FERC, I still think it's good people trying to do good things. That's not always a popular view. My clients are often on the receiving end of what we think are bad decisions by FERC. But I think at the end of the day, each of these commissioners and certainly the staff are trying to do the right thing, and what we have is an embattled commission that really just is struggling to function. Now, Commissioner, and part of that has actually, one thing I'll add just to the perception of FERC right now is we've also had public battles that we haven't had in the past. And I'll tell you, this slide may be the only one. I have some slides that might be too small to read, but I don't intend for you to read them because they're just there to gain trust, to make you think I have something to support what I'm saying. But what I have pasted up here is a Twitter feed where commissioners got into a spat over a project that's really been held up in ISO New England. And Commissioner LaFleur, I think, or maybe it was Commissioner Glick, sent out a tweet saying, wish we had been able to vote on this. And the chairman responded and said, we don't take these spats public. And to me, that was a moment where I thought, wow, what have we kind of deteriorated to that our commissioners are now fighting publicly? But the reality is it's because we have this split. It's because we don't have a majority that can take the lead and pull the minority through. And we have really divisive issues. We have issues that we have who's gonna survive? Which generation asset are we gonna choose as a winner? Or are we not gonna choose and let the states choose or let someone else choose? We have the environment. One of the biggest issues that I think just now we kind of busted through a delay, regardless of which side you might be on in terms of your opinion, the reality is the environmental conflict has delayed a lot of projects at FERC, for better or for worse. And that delay, they just reached a compromise on. So we've now had kind of the floodgates open, hopefully, for those who want projects to be approved, because Commissioner LaFleur came over and said, okay, I'll give in on this one. We'll reach a compromise and we'll approve projects that we think that she agrees are just and reasonable. Now, interestingly, I told you we lost a quorum at one point. We have a 2-2 tie. Commissioner LaFleur is leaving. Congress, some members in Congress have not been happy with how much she's advocated or not advocated for the environment, or some other issues that may be prompting her to get the message she should leave. So she's not sticking around. Now, if she leaves, we have no one teed up. We have no nominee. We're missing 2 commissioners right now, one Republican and one Democrat. I'm sorry, one Republican right now. But we're going to be missing 2 soon if she steps down before a new nominee is appointed. If she steps down, we're to a 2-1, so maybe we have the majority can power through. If she steps down and we get a full panel, again, we start to have some consistency, some direction. But as long as we end up with a 2-2 split in a world where we have a lot of binary choices, where we have to either do it or not do it, I think we're going to continue to have this kind of logjam. And so if you want something to happen, this is not a good FERC for you right now. If you don't want something to happen, not a bad FERC. So it depends on what the issue is as to whether this FERC's going to be helpful or harmful to you. With that, I'd like to just identify 5 things that I thought are noteworthy or things to be watching. I'm going to go through them relatively at a pretty high level, I hope, but I'm going to aim to save time for questions at the end. I'll try and save just enough for those things that you agreed with. We can talk about those, and those you disagreed with, we'll do privately after. But what I'd like to do is just walk through these 5 things that I think are noteworthy for you to be paying attention to. And I'll be interested after or during question and answer to hear other things that I haven't flagged. The first one is infrastructure. I mentioned the environmental debate that's been going on. And it's really, there are 2 camps. There's a camp that says FERC is a rate-making regulator. Their job is to regulate rates, not look at the environment. There's the EPA to do the environment, there's DOE, there are other agencies who deal with the environment, and FERC is supposed to just approve projects based on economics and whether it's in the public interest based on commitment, kind of commercial decisions. There's the other view that's been taken is, no, it does need to evaluate the environment, and it should look not just to the direct impacts of the project, but look all the way to the global warming impacts in China for us exporting natural gas. Those two are pretty diametrically opposed, right? And what we've had, because of that, we've had dissents where we historically, I always thought of FERC as almost a rubber stamp for any project that was economic. They would, when we had very strong environmental chairmen, we had a chairman who was pushing the environment everywhere. We still approved projects. We just put a lot of hoops in there and bells and whistles where you had to take care of the environment as you built the project. But here we have, again, a split. And so what we end up with is a lot of dissents, a lot of projects stalled. We have, during the lack of quorum, a lot of projects stalling. And FERC's been now working to push those through. One thing that is still out there pending, it may just forever be in limbo, is a notice of inquiry on this question of whether to consider the environment or not. And that notice was issued. Subsequently, the chairman and Commissioner LaFleur seemed to come together and find a path forward without resolving that notice of inquiry. We'll see if they actually, often notice of inquiries get issued and then they just float away and nothing ever comes of it. So that'll be interesting to watch to see kind of what role the environment will play, and do we have a majority commission to make that decision at some point. Pipelines and LNG are the two major project initiatives that I've seen a change at FERC, where we're now seeing more and more approved. You're seeing LNG orders come out regularly now approving LNG exports. I think back to Ms. Bagatti this morning saying we're saturated with LNG. It just reminds me of when I started practicing before FERC, it was actually the LNG import craze, and we were working to get LNG terminals built for importing LNG. And I did a lot of fatal flaw analysis, where we would look at a site and decide whether or not an LNG terminal could be put into that site. And it was always looking at stakeholder engagement issues and kind of not in my backyard sentiments. And what was always the case was you didn't have to kill a project by regulation. You didn't have to actually get the government to say you can't do it. You had to get it delayed long enough, and I was on the project side, but the opponents had to get it delayed long enough to where the economics changed. And so here we have all these projects are now being pushed through. It'll be interesting to see. We had a lot. I think there were 40-some import projects at one point proposed, and we have just a handful of import terminals actually operating, or that operated before they reversed course. And now we have, right now I think we have 4 exporting terminals that are actually in service, and we have about 27 proposed or pending. It'll be, again, for you guys who are getting paid to take natural gas right now, whether these actually move forward or not is going to be a big factor in the economics of what you're doing. What I would say is I think we're back to having a commission that doesn't rubber stamp, but moves these things forward. And so with this compromise, we've made it through this hurdle. We now have more infrastructure likely to be proposed. Electricity, FERC really has its hands tied in a lot of ways on infrastructure for electricity. We have, Order 1000 has had, I don't know if I can say limited success, or if I can say, in this room, what the reaction would be if I say any success, but Order 1000 has not performed as FERC had hoped. You have incentives. FERC has a notice of inquiry out for rate incentives for transmission investment. And I think where most of the kind of policy activity is going to be is in the capacity markets. FERC, their way to reach to where they don't have jurisdiction is to go to the organized markets that have subjected themselves to their jurisdiction. So if you color it in an organized market, if you color it in a jurisdictional wholesale market, they can then influence, generation mix or other things, or at least that's the theory. I think that's where we are right now, is that fight to see whether FERC will in fact play a role in the generation mix debate. And along those lines, I think part of the role they're going to play most with this commission is rate making. So I'm a former shipper lawyer. I used to represent shippers on pipelines. I would fight the pipelines over rates. And that practice years ago just kept getting smaller and smaller, because when you've got $15 gas, this is my theory, when you have $15 gas and $1.50 transportation, you're willing to pay the $1.50 and maybe even have a negotiated rate, but it's not a big part of your equation. When we have $3 gas, all of a sudden that $1.50 is a big piece of your cost. And if you can put pressure on that, push that down, that's a change. I think earlier today we also heard that transportation cost was actually prohibitive for some of the movements of natural gas that people might like to make. There might be a market drive for rate making. I'll tell you this commission, I think, is ready for it, is going to embrace it. They've done it so far. You look at first tax reform, done a lot of rate making on tax reform, some of that kind of mandated to them by law, but they've gone through and opened up new hearings and had new natural gas pipeline rate cases. We've got reactive power cases that nobody even noticed reactive power years ago, and all of a sudden they're all being set for hearing, and then everybody realizes, oh, there's a revenue source here, and we've started having rate cases on reactive power. You have electric transmission notice of inquiry. We're looking at incentives for transmission. And we have a return on equity NOI, where they're looking at how do we calculate return on equity. Now that was prompted in part by yet another loss in court, but that's where this commission spent a lot of energy, is focusing on rate making. And I think thinking back again to what the mentality is in the majority of the commission, or it's not a majority, in the chairman's office, is we're a rate making agency. So let's make rates. I find something really interesting is what they're doing on oil pipelines. I assume you're not buying much of your feedstock or fuel from an oil pipeline, but we heard earlier that maybe associated gas is the future. Well, if you can't get the oil out of the ground because you don't have a pipe or a truck or a train to get it somewhere, then that's going to affect the gas market in the Permian, I would think. But oil pipelines, it's really interesting to see the commission in a case involving Magellan, a declaratory order. They kind of got teed up a scenario that was very easy to reject. Magellan saw what the market was doing with oil pipelines, and let me describe it quickly for you. Oil pipelines, unlike natural gas pipelines, can't discount. They're not allowed to discount their rates. The statute says you set a rate and you have to charge everybody that rate, and you can't discount and you can't have any rebates. Well, what a lot of market participants have done is they've said, well, I'll just get my marketing affiliate to buy all the capacity at that rate, and then they can market it at the discount. I, as the parent, am better off. I've been able to market gas at the best market price. Magellan, I don't represent Magellan, I think saw that and said, well, we're not doing that, but others are. We'd like to either get to do it or stop it. So they filed a petition for declaratory order and teed up the fact pattern, and FERC said, you're not allowed to do that. That's a rebate if you set up a structure like that. So FERC, this commission saying we're going to regulate oil pipeline rates. We're not going to give you an end around to circumvent our regulation of oil pipeline rates. That's pending right now, a rehearing, but or a number of requests for clarification. But that's this commission that I think some people think is going to be hands off, saying we're not hands off, not on oil pipelines. Another one recently, Targa had an oil pipeline case where they had a new project, and it was going to be funded by their affiliate. And FERC historically has said, yeah, your affiliate can basically vouch for this. They can buy all the capacity on an oil pipeline or be an anchor shipper, and we'll count that to show that this is a viable project, and we'll count that they don't actually approve the project, but we'll count that as an indication of what a market rate is for setting your rates. In Targa, they said, actually, no, you need a third party. You need a non-affiliated party to endorse this rate, to say, I would pay that rate. And so that may not have a material impact, but if you think about that, that's this commission saying, you know what? We don't want affiliates to be able to set rates on their own pipelines without some kind of market input as to what the rate should be. I think if they're doing that in oil pipelines, think about the markets they normally regulate more with a stronger hand, power and gas. Why not be interested in rates there? Now that might be good for somebody who's not subject to their rate authority. That could be a pretty attractive thing possibly, I don't know. But that's something that I predict is this commission's going to continue to be a rate-making commission. Let's see, did I go past? Oh, I'm going backwards. Sorry for that. The next issue is federalism, and this isn't really an issue, but it's a category, and it covers a lot of the things that I think are probably most on a lot of our minds, going back again to capacity markets and other issues, where their states are subsidizing different forms of generation. I start with going back to the historical perspective of the Federal Power Act. and recognizing, I think sometimes, and this room may be better informed about the Federal Power Act than many, but I think sometimes you think the Federal Power Act is like a lot of other federal statutes where it preempts states. It gets to control, and FERC gets the ultimate authority. But it's not at all, right? The Federal Power Act was actually adopted as a gap filler when the Supreme Court said that states were not allowed to regulate interstate wholesale power sales. And so it has a lot of room for states to say state rights. Now, you would think, again, maybe with a Republican-led commission, you would have a very strong states' rights kind of yielding to the state's attitude. I'm not sure that we're seeing that. So far, I think what we have is a conflict between states' rights kind of attitudes and maybe a preference for generation mix. But I'm not sure, because what's interesting is we're not getting clear signals from the commission. We're not getting a clear direction as to where they're going. We have a number of capacity issues that are outstanding that are just held up at the commission without certainty as to where these are going. A lot of these subsidy issues felt like they were decided in 2016 when the Supreme Court rejected a Maryland subsidy that was subsidizing, I think it was natural gas generation. But in a helpful way for those who want to subsidize generation, the court said, this is unlawful because Maryland is interfering with the wholesale price of power, and that's FERC's jurisdiction. But if you would do this another way, if you would not tie it to the price of wholesale power or capacity, then we would be okay with it. So that, of course, is what states have done now. So we have nuclear subsidies have been upheld at lower courts. And we have, in ISO New England and PJM, a real battle over how the capacity markets are going to account for this. So this is a point where watching what FERC does here, and I wish I could tell you what they're going to do. That's I think anybody who tells you that, I think they're probably thinking they're smarter than they are. There are a lot of issues at stake here. There's generation. What's the right generation mix? FERC could put a foot on the pedal to try and favor one form of generation over another. Let's say coal over renewable. And that seemed to be, if you thought FERC was not independent, you would say that's what they'll do. The administration has said coal, we're pro-coal. You would think FERC would just coal, let's make coal work. But this is an independent agency. It was amazing. Pretty much the day you had a new appointment, the appointees each kind of stood up and said, I'm not doing whatever the White House tells me to do. I'm an independent agency. And that's a tradition at FERC. That's a long tradition that FERC is independent. It has three commissioners from the president's party, maximum, and 2 from any other party. But so it's weighted toward the president, and the president gets to pick nominees. But it's historically been a very independent agency. So as we think about this mix, anybody who says right away, well, obviously they're going to support coal because the administration supports coal, I don't see that as obvious. I see them as actually struggling with that quite a bit. In ISO New England, we have an interesting concept in their capacity market of letting kind of reliability or I'd say legacy generation units sell capacity obligations to new entrants. That's one path that we may have forward. We have in PJM 2 proposals that were presented to FERC, both rejected. So we don't know what the PJM capacity market's going to look like. This is a struggle that, again, if we had a working commission, and I don't mean this against the individual commissioners, I mean it really, it's a congressional or administration issue of not giving us a full commission. But without a working commission, it's hard to get direction. It's hard for the commission to say, this is what we believe in, because they don't have anything they believe in. It's 50-50 split. So again, I may be giving you more questions than answers, but I think that's something that it must be on your minds. I think that what the message I would give you is I don't see a clear answer as to where it goes. And so I think that means getting involved, if you're not involved, being involved at FERC, being involved at the state level to try and influence the way these things come out. And quite frankly, the most important place to be involved is at the stakeholder level in organized markets, for those markets where this is taking place. And that's, again, because that's part of how FERC is reaching in and getting involved in things that it otherwise doesn't have the authority to be involved in, arguably, is because they have that window through the organized markets. Second to last thing that I think is noteworthy and of interest is changing markets. And this is not really just FERC, but it's how FERC addresses the changing markets. I actually think, I'm a FERC practitioner. I practice before FERC all the time. I sit across from FERC staffers all the time. And so you would think I would say FERC is the answer to everything. I actually think most of what's going on right now is outside of FERC's control. It's them, and they're not doing it. They're not the drivers. The drivers are stakeholders in organized markets. The drivers are state regulators. Drivers may be Congress in other instances. But FERC's not doing a lot of driving these days. I think when you think about generation mix, that's a chance for them in the organized markets to step up and say, this is the answer. This is what we want to happen. We want renewable to not, or any subsidies, not just renewable, nuclear, coal, any subsidies, we want those counted or not counted in our capacity markets. What I see happening at FERC, though, is we have this mixed message being sent, and we also have a lot of generation being moved out of the market to a reliability must run kind of status. And if you do that, if you make all your needed generation reliability must run, well, we used to have that. That's called cost-based rate utility model, right? That's not an organized market. And so we're at a crossroads right now, I think, where depending on what happens at FERC, which direction they go, and if you guys have insights, I'd be thrilled to hear about them in a minute, because I don't know which way they go. I think they don't know which way to go, but that's going to really decide. I mean, years ago, I started thinking, you know what? We got a lot out of these organized markets. We got a lot of good things came out of them. And now people are getting beat up in enforcement, which we'll get to in a minute. And now people aren't getting the margins they used to get. Is the industry actually going to say, actually, we'd rather go back to that old model and be regulated in a different way? I haven't heard the industry say that yet, but it'll be interesting to see what FERC policies come out here, which direction they go in terms of capacity markets and compensating. I want to say legacy. I don't want to say legacy because they're still in need, right? It's a prejudiced word kind of to say legacy generation. But what are they going to do are they going to prop up or support out of the money existing generation? Are they going to, and is that the battle, propped up or supported renewables? Unfortunately, I've got more questions than answers on that, but I think the key place to start is actually at the stakeholder level. And we saw in PJM, FERC reject both options presented by PJM, but I think, again, ultimately, when FERC kind of smooths out its trajectory, it's going to yield more and more to the stakeholders. And that's its past has always been that way, and I don't think the past necessarily repeats itself, but I think that's a relatively safe prediction is that if an organized market proposes something that has stakeholder support, FERC is likely to not destroy it, not trash it completely. So I think that's an important place to be. Speaking of organized markets, they're expanding. They're growing. The Western energy imbalance market, to see CAISO move outside of California and start to expand east, that's a big change that people should be watching and thinking about. Is it working? Is the EIM working? I think there are a lot of strange things going on in the West, and that's probably not a new phenomenon, but I think the EIM is part of that. So it's something to watch and understand to make sure if you're in that space, that you're engaged. I also think often things in one market end up being picked up in another market. So it goes beyond CAISO even. But this is, again, FERC's foothold. So particularly for non-jurisdictional entities, the organized market may be the place you need to be. But also, as you step into it, if you're not already in it, recognize that you're committing to being essentially regulated by the stakeholders in that market, and that FERC then also has a long arm to kind of reach into that and fiddle with things. So organized markets, their role in the future, I think, is an interesting question for us to kind of continue to think about. Lastly, non-jurisdictional entities, and really I'm thinking specifically of co-ops. It's a good place to think about co-ops. I hear today about market challenges. I knew about market challenges. I know about stranded costs. I know a lot of the things I've heard talking with each of you, with some of you today about concerns you have about kind of the co-op model. Heard Mike mention the co-op model that somebody had suggested it's outdated. That blew my mind. I actually was sitting back there and I thought, what? Outdated? When I think of the next generation of what makes sense to me, it is the co-op model. And I may be naive. You guys will know better than I do about whether a co-op makes sense in the future, or the model makes sense. But to me, that's exactly, we're talking about local. We're talking about distributed. What's more local and distributed than co-ops? I struggle with the idea that a co-op model is something of the past. It may be that you've got to look to see what it looks like in the future. It may change some, but I'll be curious after at the cocktail hour or something to hear from people about what they're hearing about why the co-op model isn't. I think co-ops are kind of king, right? You're king, or going to be king again or soon. That you're not as subject to jurisdiction the way others are. So you have some flexibility there. You're local. You've got I think co-ops and/or kind of those who have rate base, who live on a rate-based diet. That's where I represent traders, and traders need volatility, and they need it to be predictable, so that they can capture profit. And they have a pretty high standard if they're investor owned for how much profit they need to capture. Everything I think about these days is lack of volatility except for unpredictable volatility, and I think about low margins. We heard earlier today a lot about low margins, that there aren't a lot of margins in gas or in power right now in most markets. Well, that's not a great place for a trading shop. It seems like it's a great place for a member-owned, somebody who can capture that benefit and not have to satisfy investors with a 12% or higher return. I don't know. I'll be curious to hear feedback on that, because I was kind of surprised to hear. I think of this as an opportunity moment. This is a time where co-ops can go and do new things to make that model be the model, as opposed to thinking about abandoning it. Finally, I actually spend most of my time on enforcement matters. Vast majority of my time is dealing with compliance and enforcement. And when the election results came out, and we had a new administration coming on, not all of my peers, some of my peers said, and colleagues said, well, don't have to worry about enforcement anymore, we're done. And some people names were being floated for being director of enforcement or this or that and the other, said, yeah, this is all we're gonna wind back everything. Forget about these cases that have confused people or these overreaches. That's all gone. We're gonna roll back enforcement. Again, I might be naive. We still have, there's time to tell. But I don't think enforcement's partisan. I don't think it's exactly political. There are things that this commission are going to do. They're going to change process, but I think that would have happened even with the Democratic commission. Everybody agreed that the notice of alleged violations, which was something where FERC, years ago, the industry all said, hey, it's not fair. You investigate somebody for 3 years, you don't tell us about it, and then you announce it, and we've already been doing it for 3 years, and then we get in trouble for it. And they said, we want to have notice of violations early on so we can get a summary of what the violation is. It ended up just being a weapon that FERC used. FERC enforcement would threaten to issue a notice of alleged violations that would publicly out a company and maybe even individuals in a company. And it had no purpose. It didn't inform the community or the industry about what the violation was, because it was very short, and it was usually still 2 years to 3 years after the investigation had begun. So almost across the board, everybody at staff I talked to agreed, all my peers agreed. It was pretty much universal. We agreed notice of alleged violations doesn't belong anymore, or didn't work. That's been removed. The commission just recently said, getting rid of notice of alleged violations. Other process changes, I think, will also come, but I don't think those are necessarily driven by this commission so much as driven by losing in court. FERC has had a number of process decisions that have gone against them in a way that makes sense for them to streamline their enforcement process and get to court sooner and faster. There has been a decline in enforcement. I can share that with you. There have been less cases. If you look at the enforcement report from last year, many fewer cases. Most everything comes from a market monitor referral. It seems like rarely anymore does FERC bring its own investigation. It's usually from a tip, from a hotline, or a market monitor referral. But I actually think that's us, not them. That's not the commission changing its perspective. That's because, number one, the market doesn't give the same opportunities it used to for enforcement matters. to arise. There's not the volatility, there's not the large positions that people have on that then they can benefit by doing things in the underlying price setting market. So the market conditions have weakened for people to take advantage of market power. Also, the market rules have been reformed. In the organized markets where people were getting in trouble, a lot of the rules have been changed so those loopholes aren't there. And then finally, we've learned better what FERC thinks is wrong. Kind of the early on and still today, there's a lot of times there's the attitude of manipulation is what FERC thinks it is when they see it after you've done it. That's changed some. That's still a struggle that people have, is trying to figure out what's FERC going to think is manipulation. What are they going to think is gaming? What are they going to think is using a tool in a way it wasn't meant to be used? But there's better clarity. We now have at least our antennae up to be able to say, oh, we've seen these cases. We know this type of behavior is likely to be problematic. So I think you have less enforcement, not because you have enforcement running from it. I talk with my colleagues across the table at FERC, and they say they're still busy. I think also the other reason you have less enforcement is they're looking for it, the investigators, the staff who've been there through 3 and 10, 3, 4, 5 administrations, maybe not 10, but been there for a long time. They don't change with the administration. They're still doing the same investigations they did before. They're just not finding as many, so they're not starting as many. And then when they want to progress them up, they're sending them up to a commission that can't do anything. They've been tied up with other things. So they send up a memo to say, we want to go push forward with this enforcement matter, and it just gets stuck there. That memo never gets looked at, is my theory. And so that's going to change. We've now freed up. We've got, I mentioned earlier, with LaFleur's compromise, we now have some momentum to actually do things. So it might be that memo that's been sitting there now gets looked at. There is a division within FERC, though. Some of the appointees who've been appointed by the commissioner have been outspoken critics of FERC, where they've actually written articles saying FERC is wrong on all these theories of manipulation. But I'll caution, so they're there, and there's this infighting within FERC, I think, that's going on right now about what is manipulation, what is a violation of our rules. But I'll caution you that since we've had this new commission, we've had a number of settlements that all gave the commission an opportunity to drop cases without settling them or to settle them and clarify their rules. And substantively, nothing has changed. Substantively, we are exactly where we were 3 years ago, 4 years ago. We're where we've been ever since the kind of implementation of the market manipulation rule after the Western energy crisis. So, again, I don't think it's partisan. I think we've had some of the toughest enforcement under Republican commissioners, but I do think there are signs that this commission would like to change enforcement, but then they got to be counterweighed with the fact that we still have the same director of enforcement that we had before this commission took over. We still have cases being settled on the same basis. So again, the caution I bring is that I don't think enforcement's gone away. I also think to the market point, the point that I think we're just not in a very compliant market space right now in a way. Enforcement's cyclical. It always seems we kind of relax, people figure out how to play within the rules and what the rules are, and we kind of slow down, and then some big crisis happens, and then the regulator looks more closely at some area and kind of finds new things to enforce against. So we had, after the Western energy crisis, we had a series of enforcement cases, and then we kind of dealt with capacity release for a little while and some little kind of smaller things, and then we had the financial crisis, and we started looking at gaming and a lot of other things going on in financial markets. So I think enforcement's cyclical, but we've got to just not have compliance be cyclical. Compliance is constant, and that way we're always ready when enforcement comes back. I think where enforcement's focus right now is, again, mostly market-driven more than policy-driven, is on rate making. So if you have to submit cost of service anywhere, caution, beware. You're submitting cost of service to a market, and they're paying you based on that, or there's a potential they'll pay you based on that. That's rate making, right? So if you submit something that has costs in it that aren't real or that are old, that have expired, you forgot to take out the carbon, the emissions costs or some other factor that goes into your costs, that's a violation. That's something I think FERC's gonna be enforcing going forward. They have to date, and they'll continue. And price distortions. So not just cost, but also dispatch. Any kind of, again, when we think about the definition that FERC has applied to manipulation, they define it as any act that has the purpose of interfering or disrupting a well-functioning market. And staff tends to take that purpose and say with the effect of interfering with well-functioning markets. So what you find is you've got to be really cognizant of how you're offering your generation or otherwise participating in a market, in an organized market, that you're being you're doing it in a manner that FERC will see as being tied to the physical supply and demand and not trying to take advantage of some market design flaw. So I think we'll continue to see some of those cases where people adjust their parameters in a way that make their unit get picked up in the day ahead, but definitely not run or really encourage them not to run in real time. And they do that in a way that FERC finds to be manipulative, to take advantage of some kind of out-of-market payment, like a recent settlement that just recently came out. But probably on this slide, the one thing I would highlight, I said, I hope I share something with you you didn't know. This is the one I would take away as maybe the best insight that I can share with you to get you ready to make sure you're safe with enforcement. And that is stakeholder disputes often are the canary in the coal mine for enforcement. Time and time again, it seems that there's a stakeholder dispute, there's something going on at FERC where people are fighting over cost allocation, and then somebody loses, and then lo and behold, their investigation started up on the same subject. Best example might be the ISO New England's fuel reliability dispute. There we had ISO New England change its interpretation of how committed someone had to be, what fuel obligations they had, how firm their fuel supply had to be. Generators filed a complaint to try and prevent that interpretation from moving forward. Soon after those were kind of going through the FERC process, we have 2 enforcement matters tied to fuel costs. And we had a lot more investigations. These are 2 that actually ended up with settlements. There were a lot of investigations into fuel in ISO New England. All around, FERC kind of being clued into behavior in ISO New England that they didn't like, that they then investigated. So that, if you were watching at the time, both of these cases, Footprint Power and Entergy Nuclear, they're both about lining up fuel supply in ISO New England, and they both occurred after or around the same, after the issue was flagged and around the same time as it was being resolved. And if I was in their compliance team, what I would say is look at that. That's a big issue right now, fuel and fuel management. So we need to take an extra special look at what we're doing in fuel management. Similarly in PJM, there was a market, quote unquote, market design flaw discovered. The market monitor flagged that this lost opportunity cost credit, this make-whole payment, was not calculating the payments correctly. So it basically made people, any generator who got an award and was eligible for this make-whole payment was better off not being dispatched in real time than being dispatched. The way the calculation worked, it kept you whole, except for it forgot to subtract or take into account the fact that you didn't have to turn on your unit or have a min-run expense. It led to a PJM filing where they tried to correct the way they were calculating the make-whole payment. And around that same time, you have 2 other cases. One, the Virginia Electric Power case, just out maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, where you have strategies built around capturing that extra value in a make-whole payment. Now, I am confident that none of the people involved in any of these cases thought they could be accused of manipulating the market or really probably even violating any rule. What they thought they were doing was making rational economic decisions about taking a bet on, in the first case, they were betting on whether their fuel supply would show up or not. So in Footprint, real quick facts, Footprint had, it's a kind of neat company that goes around and buys old coal plants and then replaces them with nice shiny new gas plants. And so the footprint, I think, comes from the idea they take the footprint of an old plant and replace it with a new plant. They bought an old plant that had oil in the ground, had about 6 months left of capacity obligations. Well, they looked at the inventory of the oil in ground and said, wow, that's enough for handle a year's worth of runs. This plant doesn't run that regularly. So they didn't refill it. You know, they didn't want to be stuck, I think, with that inventory at the end of the day. As time went on, in that 6-month period, they actually started being run, and they were burning fuel. But they kept kind of betting on, you know what, I think we're not going to get run. I think we shouldn't. I can't stomach buying this fuel that they're going to lose money on. And so they basically just bet that they were not going to actually be forced to run. And they kept offering the day ahead to meet their capacity obligation, and then hoping they didn't get run in real time, so they didn't have to burn the fuel. They were accused of misrepresentations and essentially market manipulation in their offers, that they were misrepresenting to ISO New England their availability and their fuel supply. That case actually went to a show cause level, meaning FERC went public against them and was going to prosecute them. And then subsequently staff said, never mind, actually. It was, I think, a $2 million case. And staff said, actually, you know what? Now that it's gone public, answers that were given by Footprint explain that their offers weren't all misrepresentations. There were some that still were in staff's eyes, but not all of them. And staff actually recommended they withdraw and that they not proceed with that case. And so again, my colleagues and peers all said, whoa, look, this is the new commission. They're not going to bring these kinds of cases anymore. But then after that, we've got Entergy comes up, and I'll tell you in a minute why I think they dropped the Footprint case. But so we're all kind of going, wow, that's a head scratcher. I've never seen staff drop a case after going public with it, particularly when they still say there's a violation. It's just a smaller violation. Well, Entergy had firm transportation to a gas power plant, and they had run an imbalance for the month of December where they had a lot of gas on their operating balancing agreement. So they had gas that they could pull from theoretically without scheduling to just burn off an imbalance. What that tells me is they were probably getting day-ahead awards and then being told don't run. And so their expectation probably was we are likely to get a day-ahead award and likely not to have to run. So do we want to keep adding to that imbalance and buying gas to run every day when we're probably not going to have to run? So what they instructed their energy manager to do was to only schedule a fraction of what they needed to burn their full day-ahead commitment and burn the rest off of their OBA. And turns out there was a critical notice in place that said you had to stick to your schedules. And so they had to call up the ISO ultimately and say, we can't run to our full amount of our day-ahead commitment. Now, that case was enforced against. So I would call that an honest mistake, right? That was a wager or they didn't notice that they didn't recognize that the critical notice was actually going to stop them from performing. They decided to burn off, if they needed to, burn off their imbalance. And they ended up with a settlement with FERC, and I want to say in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, or $100,000, so $115,000. That tells me that Footprint wasn't dropped because it was small. Footprint, I think, and I don't know, I wasn't involved, and if I was, I wouldn't be able to share this speculation with you. But Footprint, I think, was dropped because rumor has it that it was an embarrassing case for FERC to have to bring. They were going to have to fight and have things come out about their investigation process that would not be good for them. And that makes sense to me. I don't know, I don't have personal reason to know that, but that makes sense that would be why staff would back down, is they had had a misstep somewhere in the process and realized they're losing in court. They don't want to go to court and have another loss. And so let's back down. So I think reading those two together, we cannot possibly say FERC is running from enforcement now. I think that's an anomaly that we've got to set to the side. The LOC is the same way. We had GDF Suez had a settlement a few years ago on LOC. This Virginia Electric settlement that just came out recently was the same kind of situation where it's the kind of things that the people who criticized FERC from the outside and now are in the building, it's the same things that they were criticizing. So I think we can't take a lot away from the fact that we have a different commission, that anything's changed on enforcement yet. Last thing on enforcement that I'd like to leave you with, again, I think the key takeaway is the stakeholder disputes. But with that is change. And that anytime there's a change, and there's a lot of change right now, a lot of change in our industry, anytime there's change, there is an elevated compliance risk. You've got change in new markets, so EIM market. If you were to transact in EIM, that's a new market that has weird things going on in it. There are opportunities to get crosswise with how FERC thinks you should be behaving in that market. In new products with storage, oh my goodness, there's so many questions about how storage can function in a market effectively, how to get revenue out of a storage asset in an organized market. As those units come on, those changes are opportunities for FERC to say, we disagree with how you're offering that. As units get out of the money, there's more desperation to try and squeeze something out of them. So many cases that I've been involved in involved what appeared to now be a useless asset, and somebody looked at the tariff and said, oh, actually it's not useless, we can get paid for doing this. And then FERC saying, well, you weren't supposed to get paid for that. That wasn't the intent behind that product. And so, again, anytime there's change, compliance moment. And then I think lastly, there are changes in the stack. And that, a number of the cases I've worked on also have, the compliance moment has come out of people behaving in a way and the stack flipping on them or otherwise changing so that renewables replace their unit, and then finding ways to manage that risk. And so as you guys think going forward about going back to the 5 issues, I think we need to think about infrastructure. Specifically, each of you have different infrastructure situations, but recognize that FERC is now a green light again on infrastructure for oil and gas, or for gas and LNG exports. Still keeping in mind that just because FERC approves it doesn't mean it gets built. Federalism, thinking about being what your involvement, what your exposure to the federalism issue is, and the stakeholder process, being part of that process, having an avenue like ACES to be involved and keep you informed on those kinds of things. And then this change in the markets, change in your behavior, any kind of change that takes place, it's a compliance moment. And I think we often think of cooperatives and kind of entities that serve a public interest as not being susceptible to enforcement. And I just want to dissuade you of that. I mean, I can look back at other enforcement examples and share with you that there are companies that aren't profit-seeking companies that still end up crossroads with FERC. So keep these in mind as we go through these changes. I think that ultimately we've got a lot bigger things than enforcement to think about right now in the changing environment, but don't forget enforcement, because it's not something that's, I think, gone away, and I think these changes are just going to make it come back up and be a big issue for people. So I saved just enough time, I think, for you to agree with everything you agreed with. But I actually would welcome you. I'm a former teacher, and I used to play a game, Stump the Chump, where my students could ask me any question, any at all, and I was not afraid to be completely embarrassed. So I invite you to share your thoughts on any of the issues I've raised, or ask a question. If there's something I didn't cover that you'd be interested in, I can try and cover, or if there's something I said you disagree with, challenge me. I'd love to learn from you and let others learn from you as well. Anybody? I see a hand up in the back.
I wanted to scream, but I thought I'd wait for a microphone. In the Southeast, there seems to be a large hole where we don't have an ISO or an RTO. And I'm wondering if you can share what thoughts FERC might have with that. It's a two-part question. So I'd say, what are they thinking at FERC? And B, from your perspective, what benefits do end consumers lose by not being in an organized market?
Good. So to your first question, that's actually really interesting that comes up, because I was just speaking with someone yesterday about how I've had a lot of experience in the Pacific Northwest, but haven't had much encounters in the Southeast with FERC taking interest. I mean, NERC, like reliability issues for sure, but because there aren't the organized markets, I always think organized markets attract compliance risk. Because an organized market, almost by definition, is an artificial market. And artificial markets create loopholes that people can take advantage of. So I think in the Southeast, relatively low kind of market manipulation risk, but that may just be that FERC hasn't recognized that yet, because someone I was speaking with kind of helped me realize that there's market power in that space. There are things that could happen that I think FERC would disagree with. I think a couple things keeps it from coming to FERC's attention. One is no market monitor. So who's going to refer somebody in the Southeast to FERC? Just a competitor. There's no market monitor there to escalate an issue. Again, I think another piece of it though is there are less market rules to be able to take advantage of a loophole. To your second question about kind of downside to not being in an ISO RTO, or what benefits you're missing. I suspect most of you in this room will have a better take on that. You'll have thought about that a lot more. From my perspective, what organized markets do is hopefully give you liquidity and flexibility. So hopefully they create a working marketplace where you can get better results, more efficient results, and you can have better reliability. If markets stop doing that because of these fights that we're having, or if they expand in ways that don't make sense, I don't know that that's a benefit you're really giving up. And it may be that outside of a market you can get that benefit. That's what I think of when I think of organized markets. Why I would want to join one is to get access to the markets, kind of the liquidity, the ability to transact and not have to work bilaterally. When the dealings I've had in the Pacific Northwest, I've always been blown away by the kind of the phone calls that need to be made and the kind of the process there as compared to an organized market. But I suspect others in the room have even better insights on the pros and cons of that. The one con I would say is you're subjecting yourself to the rules of that market. And so just better make sure you investigate that market and understand what that means, because your stakeholders, the governance of the market are going to drive kind of your future behavior having become a member. Anybody else have a comment, question, or criticism? I've tried to keep my hands exposed. Oh, Mike.
Maybe just repeat the question. Why is it so difficult to fill these FERC positions? When we were younger people, when we were filling FERC positions back in the day, it seemed like it was a prize or it was an honor, and now it's like people run away. How come we're not keeping the commission, full staff or at full?
So I don't know for sure, honestly, and I don't mean to get it all swept up in the politics of that we have right now. But what I find is Congress is waiting for a nominee and they're not getting one from the White House. And I think it's that the White House doesn't have this as a priority. I think they have a lot of other things on their plate that they're looking at, and I don't think they are thinking about FERC. Anybody is that a disagreement? I think that they're not. Industry has sent letters to say we need a nominee, please get one. Now the Democrats will put forward their nominee to the White House, so that's on the Democrats to do, and then the White House picks a Republican and then nominates both of them. And right now, it's amazing to me that we have empty seats and we don't have any nominees. And maybe, to your question, maybe it's that people are declining. They're going around asking everybody. I haven't been asked yet, but they may be asking everybody else, and they're not getting people willing. And maybe that could be political climate, but I honestly think FERC has been insulated from the political climate for the most part. You did have the environmentalists go into the commissioners' personal homes and things and harassing them, whether that impacts people's decision or not. But I haven't heard that it's because people aren't willing to be commissioner. I've heard, my impression is it's because we're not picking people to be commissioners. Yes?
Regulatory agencies have had the advantage of the Chevron deference to Supreme Court in prior years. There's the theory that this present Supreme Court may not provide that same Chevron deference. How does that impact a regulatory body such as FERC? Does it impact the type of decisions they make, that they think that they won't get the difference and so they'll look at it differently or decide differently?
I don't think it'll have a major impact. I think the greatest impact it could have is less well-reasoned decisions, less well-written decisions. If you don't think you're going to have somebody look over your shoulder and change it, then you don't have to build as strong of a case. What we actually do for our clients in these proceedings, when we're like, let's say it's a project that's being approved, we will actually push FERC to write a really good order. We will challenge them and say, that's not strong enough. You need to cover that environmental issue more. You need to cover this more and that more. Because if you get a bad order out and go to court and lose, you've just delayed your project again further. And so I don't think it'll impact their decision making. I think also they can't rely on it yet, so we'll have to wait and see if that went away, maybe that has an impact in the future. I would say for them to rely on that kind of expectation now would be like us relying on thinking they're not going to enforce rules anymore and stop following the rules. I think what will happen is the commission is going to make its majority decision whenever it can get one, and it'll be up to staff to write a well-reasoned defense of that position, and you just may have a weakening of that process. The one thing that the commission actually has been working on with the new staff that's been brought in is to try and ramp up their appellate preparations. So they basically, on rehearing, write a better rehearing order that doesn't reopen, that checks the boxes, but otherwise doesn't create new problems for them. So you have this kind of fine tuning of the process, but not really changing the outcome, I think.
Do you anticipate?
Where am I looking?
Over here. Do you anticipate that FERC will rethink its refusal to grant the waiver on the Green Hat order, recognizing that the significant loss can possibly even triple if they don't?
I'm so confused by FERC's conduct there and really most of the waiver requests that are out there pending right now. I don't understand the inaction. In terms of going back and reversing, I'm not sure that anything has changed on the commission. I'm trying to think of who was on that first order. I don't think we've changed commissioners in the chairs or changed anything else that would lead me to think they'll change direction on that. And it'll probably happen before we get a new commission. You could imagine new commissioners coming in and contributing to that reversal. Again, I'm going to try and avoid predictions because I think in this environment that I'll just look a fool. But I'm not aware of anything that would change their direction. Any kind of new information that has come to light that should impact their decision. Should's not the right word because I'm not saying they made the right decision. But so long way of saying, I don't know. That'll be interesting to see. Sorry, that's not more helpful. Anything else? Well, I will leave you with one last thought just about really enforcement. But as I hear you talking about co-op issues, it might be a useful thing to think about for co-ops generally for the issues you're facing. And that's just when I was listening to something earlier, I was thinking about how when I was a kid and first learning to drive, I used to look in the rearview mirror all the time, and I prided myself on how aware I was at what was behind me. And I actually had this thing that I never did, trust me, I never did this, but I had this idea of, wonder if you could actually drive looking in the rearview mirror. Could you actually predict from like this, whatever, what's going on ahead of you, and could I actually manage to drive without looking forward and just looking in the rearview mirror? And luckily I never tested that, and that's why I'm here today. But the lesson I'll take is enforcement, we treat that way. We always look at what the last case was, and we don't try and look forward. And that's where that stakeholder process is a place I want you to think about looking. And as we think about the role of co-ops, I think you got to look back, and that panel this morning was inspiring to me. It actually got me really pepped up to talk with you because I was listening to kind of the history of ACES and hearing about the process. We need to understand have the inspiration from what we've done and have the know-with-all, the experience. But things are changing, so we got to find the right way to adjust. And so on enforcement, I really bring that to you because I know more about enforcement than your guys' journey as co-ops. But I think for enforcement, that is advice to live by, is to look forward and predict rather than just looking at the last crisis. But I think it may be relevant to all of your decisions as you think about these things, is realize that the co-op model, I think, is perfect for the future, and it's just figuring out how you fit it within that. But with that, I leave you humbly with that story and hope that you got at least one useful thing out of this. I think I heard maybe some things I'll hear about at the reception about disagreeing with, and appreciate your time. Thank you.